The Women's Christian Temperance Union was an organization that was founded in 1874 after the Women's Crusade. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was groups of women that would meet and protest alcohol as well as advocate for the prohibition of alcohol. They held national conventions at least once every year. The things that the Women's Christian Temperance Union had hoped to accomplish and what they actually accomplished can be compared and contrasted. The Women's Christian Temperance Union hoped to prohibit alcohol for generations and generations, as well as making everyone aware of the serious effects that alcohol was having on the people and the community, to make it so that nobody would want to drink anymore. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was an aid in getting the 18th Amendment, which prohibits alcohol, passed, by making people aware and encouraging and influencing members of Congress to pass the 18th Amendment. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was successful in making alcohol illegal. However, alcohol was only illegal for 14 years, not generations and generations. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was successful in making some people aware of the effects that alcohol was having on the people and the community. The Women's Christian Temperance Union had affected several people because after they were made aware, they stopped drinking alcohol and then oftentimes helped in the protest against alcohol and the advocating for prohibiting alcohol. The conclusion that can be drawn about how successful the Women's Christian Temperance Union is that they were very successful in the beginning and then became less and less successful as time went on, and they had an impact on people then. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was successful in passing legislation prohibiting alcohol. However, later legislation was passed allowing alcohol to be legal. They were successful in making several people aware of the effects of alcohol on the people and the community, and making them want to quit drinking. However, there were multiple masses of people that drank and got alcohol legally when the 18th Amendment was in place because they did not want to stop drinking alcohol. In the end result, the Women's Christian Temperance Union was originally partially successful, but then eventually all that they had hoped to accomplish was no longer accomplished. The Women's Christian Temperance Union had an impact on people because there were several people that still did not drink anymore, even when alcohol was made legal again. There are several Women's Christian Temperance Union fountains around the country in appreciation of what they did, or they are placed to raise awareness for the goals of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. The Women's Christian Temperance Union did not just exist in the United States. They are present in Canada and Australia as well as other countries. Many people assumed that the Women's Christian Temperance Union faded out after the 18th Amendment passed, but they still exist. The Women's Christian Temperance Union still advocates for the prohibition of alcohol, but they also advocate for abstinence from drugs or anything believed to be harmful and bad or against Christian beliefs. This formulates questions such as, who was allowed to be a member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union? What were the main goals of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and what obstacles did the Women's Christian Temperance Union face? These questions can be answered. In a sense, men and women were both allowed to be members of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Men were allowed to join. They had to vow not to drink alcohol and help advocate for prohibition. The main goals of the Women's Christian Temperance Union were to encourage everyone to abstain from alcohol as well as make alcohol illegal. The Women's Christian Temperance Union faced several obstacles, one of the largest being people that were opposed to prohibiting alcohol. The people that were opposed to prohibiting alcohol made it harder for the Women's Christian Temperance Union to inform and convince people that alcohol was bad and needed to be prohibited. The conclusion can be drawn that the obstacles the Women's Christian Temperance Union faced were rough, but the obstacles did not stop them, and they were somewhat successful in the end. The assumptions of what the Women's Christian Temperance Union believed affected how the information was presented, because in order to get information spread, the platform given was the best option to spread their information, because then people had an idea about what the Women's Christian Temperance Union stood for. It was assumed that people in the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the organization itself were completely against all things related to alcohol. This helped them out because what was assumed was true. The Women's Christian Temperance Union overall was very strong. While they faced several large obstacles, they weathered out the storm and continued fighting for what they truly and honestly believed in. While the Women's Christian Temperance Union in the end had no legal effect regarding to alcohol, they did have an impact on the people. After all the protesting that the Women's Christian Temperance Union did, a lot of people started to realize the effects that alcohol was having on the people and on the community. There were many people that stopped drinking alcohol completely, some that reduced the amount of alcohol they were drinking and were more cautious with the alcohol they were drinking, and then there were many people that refused to believe what was being said and kept doing the exact same thing they were doing before in regards to drinking alcohol. Women's Christian Temperance Union today is not like it was back in the early 20th century. In the early 20th century, there were women everywhere that were constantly protesting against alcohol, whereas now there are no longer large protests out in the street. Today's version of the Women's Christian Temperance Union is silent in comparison to how it was in the early 20th century, which is why many people do not know that they still exist here in the United States. Overall, the Women's Christian Temperance Union used every person and advantage they could in order to maximize their success and get their agenda across. They ended up being very successful, and then things went downhill when alcohol became legal again.